Give me one moment. In the meantime, you can prepare your Haggadah. And we'll get going. Okay, I'm spotlighting myself. If you want to take off the spotlight, you can. You can just go to the top of the right corner of the screen and change your view, how you see the video. Welcome to one and to all those who have joined us for tonight's Haggadah Insights evening. I hope this will benefit you as you prepare for the Seder night. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute. Everyone can unmute themselves throughout the evening. If there's noise around you, try and keep muted because that does disrupt the class. But if you would like to share, feel free to unmute yourself and contribute towards the discussion. I would love to hear from you. So, as somewhat of an introduction, I'd like to start with this. It's called Seder Pesach. It's called a Seder. Seder Lel HaSeder, the night of the Seder. And we know that the Seder night has a certain order to it. That's what Seder means. Seder means an order to the Seder table. Lel HaSeder. We know there are 15 steps to the Seder night. As we start with Kadesh, Urchatz, if you look at the beginning of the Haggadah, you'll see it all there. The Kadesh, Urchatz, Karpas Yachatz, Magid Rochsa, Moitzi Matzah, Mara Korech, Shulchan Aruch, Sofan Barech, Hallel, Nirtza. Nirtza is the final one. Nirtza is a prayer which generally is said in terms of a song. It's a prayer that Hashem should accept our Seder favorably. That's how we end. Nirtza, please accept what we've done here tonight, right? It should be ratzon, it should be a willing service in front of you, and you should be able to answer our prayers. And that's what we sing the Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim next year in Jerusalem. So people don't often see it that way. We don't often see the Seder night as being a service, right? A ritual. We often see it as being like a social gathering or a get-together or reminiscing or a classroom sort of get together with our families where we can talk over the history of the Jewish people. But it's more than that. It's actually a spiritual service. That's what it is. And that's why we are dressed in Shabbos and Yom Tov clothing at the Seder table. Some have the custom to wear a kittel. Others wear their regular Shabbos garb. Whatever the custom may be, we're dressed in our proper clothing. I personally have the custom of wearing my jacket or my kapota, my Shabbos jacket and hat the entire time, throughout the entire Seder night, besides Shulchan Aruch, which is more of a meal, so more relaxed. But generally speaking, it's a very, very spiritual process. And as I said, it ends with the word Nirtza, with the phase of Nirtza, which Nirtza is an ask of Hashem to please accept our services of the Seder night. Where else do we see that this is a holy service, a holy ritual? Well, if you look at the Seder plate, and as I said, if you have the Haggadah in front of you, you'll be able to see this. But if you don't, you can still trust me on it. If you look at the Seder plate, we've actually got an interesting spelling here. So, Maror, I'm going to go in a particular order. Maror is mem, starts with a mem. So does matzah start with mem. Zroya starts with a zayin. Beitza, the egg, zroya is a shank bone. Beitza, the egg, starts with a bet, the egg. Charoset, which is the apple mix with wine and other ingredients. Each person has a different concoction of how to make charoset. But that's a chet. And then karpas, which is the vegetable, in many cases it's potato, ends with a chaf. If you read it that way, Mem Zayin, Bet Chet Chaf, it's read as Mizbechacha or Mizbeach. Mizbechacha means your Mizbeach. What is the Mizbeach? Mizbeach is an altar upon which we offer up sacrifices. This week's Torah portion, Vayikra, speaks about the offering of sacrifices. So the Kaira, the Seder plate, and the entire structure of the Seder night is compared to a Mizbeach. It's a spiritual ritual of ours. And in order to make it a ritual, in order to make it a service, we've got to be prepared. You can't just rock up and expect to be inspired and motivated by the proceedings of the Seder night. In fact, as someone I learned with recently commented, if you just rock up to the Seder night, it's extremely uninspiring. It becomes a big balagan. There's kids screaming. Halavai, we can get together with our families over COVID time, but there's kids screaming and there's food being thrown around and there's maror and lettuce and matzah. It's a big balagan. And my answer to this person who said that to me was, it's only a balagan if you're not prepared. If you do the necessary preparation, then by the time you come, every step of the Seder is filled with meaning. And you may not have time to talk about the meaning of the Seder night on the night, but you feel that every step has a sense of depth to it. And especially if you've done the necessary preparation beforehand. So that's what we're doing here tonight. We're preparing ourselves appropriately. Hopefully you can jot down some notes, follow along in the Haggadah, memorize in your own mind, and hopefully you can share this to get some of these ideas with your families and friends. Why 15 steps? It's known as 15 steps. In fact, there are 15 Shir LaMa'alot. There are 15 Psalms in Tehillim from Kuf Chaf, from Psalm 120. There are 15 steps, and the actual Psalm there, it says Shir LaMa'alot, right? A song of ascent. How many songs of ascent are there? 15. And there are 15 steps in the Haggadah too. Why 15? So the name of Hashem is Yud Hey. Yud is 10, Hey is 5. There are so many gematrias and numerical values and hints, and I'm going to share some of those. They're fascinating, the depth of the Seder night. So Yud Hey are the letters of Hashem's name. Yud is 10, Hey is 5, that's 15. What's unique about Yud Hey? So the mystics explain that Yud is compared to the spark of wisdom. It's the initial spark of a concept of an idea that we have in our minds. That's Yud. Hey is already more broad than the Yud. Hey is already a developed letter of the alphabet. There's width and length to the letter Hey. Hey, in Kabbalistic terminology, represents Bina, which means understanding. So Yud represents the spark of Chokhmah, the spark of wisdom, and Hey represents breadth and width and length to the concept, which is more of understanding. And that's Yud Hey. And the message that the rabbis teach us here in the Seder night is, while Pesach is definitely about faith, it's about emunah, it's about belief in God, it's about kabbalat all, accepting, following God into the desert without knowing where we're going. That's what Pesach is about. Total faith and commitment to God. But with that comes the responsibility of intellectually trying to understand the meaning and the significance of the Seder, of Pesach, to the best of our ability. And that's the Yud and the Hey. On the one hand, there's an acceptance of faith and emunah in God. At the same time, the 15 steps represented by Yud and Hey represent the wisdom and understanding that a person is supposed to have in trying to appreciate every detail and every step. Sometimes you got to take a step back and say, okay, I've tried to research this. I've tried to investigate this. I haven't found the proper answers, and that's not going to deter me. I'm still going to continue. But until that point, we've got the obligation of researching and trying to understand. And that's what we're going to do here tonight. It tried to bring some depth and understanding and appreciation and meaning to the steps of the Leil HaSeder. And bear with me as I move around on various different subjects. So the first thing is that we're going to have an interesting Kiddush this year, first night Seder. So first night Seder this year is going to be Saturday night, Motzei Shabbos, which creates a big balagan with our chametz over Friday and Shabbos. I'm not going to go into the details of that. Those of you that are following the various email communications and updates from the shul, you'll see that there's going to be some differences this year than all other years as we prepare for Pesach. But in particular, the Seder night is going to be Saturday night, Motzei Shabbos. And as a result, there's going to be an interesting Kiddush, which you have to look out for. And I'm bringing this to your attention now. It's all printed in the Haggadah, but you got to be aware of it. Okay, so follow me. The Kiddush is called Yak Nahaz. That's the acronym. Yak Nahaz. Try and stop a Jew down the street. Next time you walk into Moishi's and you meet someone, just ask them if they know what Yak Nahaz is. It's a good test of someone's general knowledge. What is Yak Nahaz? So it stands for a 5-part Kiddush ceremony that is said specifically on Saturday night. Specifically on a Saturday night. Why is it unique? Because on the one hand, you're leaving Shabbos, so there's a sense of Havdalah. On the other hand, you're going into Yom Tov, so there's a sense of Kiddush. So somehow you got to do one ceremony, needs to have a combination of both. And that's when we have Yak Nahaz. So if someone stops you in Moishi's and says to you, excuse me, what is Yak Nahaz? Your answer should be, it's that special ceremony that we do between Shabbos to Yom Tov. Okay, on a Saturday night. What is it? Yud is Yayin, because you make Hagofen. Kuf, Yak, Kuf is Kiddush, which is the main part of the Kiddush. You then have Ner, because you got to say a bracha on the candles that are lit on the Shabbos table. You just look at the candles. No need to put your hands by the candles like you normally do on Saturday night. You just look at the candles that are sitting there, the Yom Tov candles. That's Ner and Nun. Hey is the Havdalah. You say a paragraph of Havdalah because you're saying goodbye to Shabbos. And Zayin is Zman, which means Shechianu. You're now going to say Shechianu at the end of this service because you now begin a new Yom Tov. So just to go through that again, Yak Nahaz is the acronym, Yak Nahaz. Yayin, Kiddush, Ner, the candle. Havdalah, Zman being Shechianu. Now, if you don't look out for this, you may miss it entirely. So that's the heads up. Look out for the 5 steps of the Kiddush ceremony on Motzei Shabbos, Saturday night next week as we move into the Seder night. And once again, if you have any questions, you can more than welcome to unmute yourself, or if you wish, you can do so at the end, and we can have a bit of Q&A at that point in time. And we'll definitely do that. We'll stay on the line at the end for Q&A. Okay. So one of the points I wanted to highlight tonight is an interesting insight into the matzah. We know that the matzah, there's different shaped matzahs. I'm sure you figured that out, right? So the machine matzah is always square because to make a machine matzah round, you need to have a very sophisticated type of machine. Generally, matzahs fit into a mold of a square mold, and so matzahs are generally square when they come out of the machine. That being said, there's hand matzah, and hand matzah is round, right? Now, I want to just correct something. You can get shmura matzah in machine too. There is shmura matzah that's watched over from the moment of harvesting. That's called the shmura matzah. Not just the moment of manufacturing, but even the moment of harvesting is called shmura matzah. It's the better type of matzah, specifically better for the Seder night to get yourself a box of shmura matzah. It's a bit more expensive than the regular matzah, but this is matzah that's being watched from the moment of harvesting and definitely is more stringent in terms of its kashrut and ideal. But so shmura matzah can be in machine matzah too. There's something about the handmade matzah because it's under your watch the entire time. The machine may be clean, but nonetheless, it's left your eye for some part of the process. And therefore, there's something about having also handmade matzah too. But I want to ask the question, why is it that we have round matzah? Right? Why wasn't matzah, and this is a discussion you could possibly have around your Seder table. Why square matzah? Why round matzah? And guess what? There are some insights on this too. Don't know if you've ever heard this before. What's round and what's square? So first of all, and I would use this as a conversation around the table. It's a beautiful conversation. Square and round represent two parts of life. Okay? Square represents the rigid parts of life, the technical parts of life. What you can do, what you can't do. Right? Judaism, what's kosher, what's not kosher. That's the square. Rigid sides, rigid corners. But you can't function your whole life just on square. Often it's used derogatory. It's used as a derogatory way of describing someone. Someone who's very square is not a good thing because you're too rigid if you're too square. So what's round? Round represents the emotional side of a person. Love is round. Emotions is round. Why? Because it's not defined and it's not limited. It's round and it goes around and around in a circle and there's never an end and there's never a beginning and there's no four walls or corners. It just goes round and round. And in our lives, we have that too. In Judaism, it's not the halacha side of Judaism. The round circle is the emotional side of Judaism. What's my kavanah? What's my intent when I daven or when I do a mitzvah? That's not defined. That's not finite and limited. That's very much unlimited, like the circle that goes round and round. That's a very important variable in my service of God. Take a marriage, for example. A marriage needs to have both as well, right? You need to have certain guidelines when it comes to marriage. How to act appropriately or inappropriately. What's inappropriate, what's appropriate when it comes to a relationship. That's the square part of a relationship. And then you've got to have the emotional side. You've got to have the emotional side. Because just living a relationship that is functional is not ideal. You need to have a relationship that is emotional. And that emotion is defined by the circle. And I often share this idea with the bride and groom under the chuppah. If you think about it, the chuppah is square on top of them. But the color, the bride, goes around in a circle around the groom. So under the chuppah, you actually have both elements. You've got the square shape, which represents the rigid, technical logistics of a relationship. And then you have the round circle of the bride circling the groom, which represents the emotional parts of a relationship. And I would open this up for a discussion at your Pesach table, and that is, how do you define your Judaism? Some people are very square people. So Judaism is about what can I do and what can't I do? What am I allowed to do? What aren't I allowed to do? That's what Judaism is about. Or for some people, it's very round. It's not so much about what I can or can't do. It's what do I feel? What's inside my heart? Right? I once went up to an Israeli in Israel and asked him to put on tefillin with me. And he said, Bachur, I was a student then. Ani Yehudi balev. I'm a Jew in my heart. I don't have to put on tefillin. Leave me alone. Ani Yehudi balev. I'm a Jew in my heart. Okay? Some people are round circles. They're emotional people. They have an emotional connection. But leave them out of the rules and regulations. They don't want to hear about it. And some people prefer the rules and regulations, the square type relationship. But don't get them started with love and emotion and all that stuff. It's a waste of time for them. And they can't appreciate the round circle. So it's something to look at on the Seder night, the square or the round. There's more to this, and I want to share this with you. It's brought down in the commentators that bread used to indicate how many gods you had. In the times of idol worship, in the times of the deities, you would use your bread, which was a staple food, to indicate how many gods you have. And you would do that by designing your bread and how many points your bread would have. So if your bread would have 2 or 3, it meant you have 3 different gods that you serve, 4 different gods that you serve. It's brought down that Avraham Avinu is brought down in the commentaries when Avraham Avinu hosted the malachim, the angels, in his home, and they came to tell Sarah that Sarah was going to have a baby. It says that Avraham, it was actually Pesach time, because Yitzchak was born a year later in Pesach, over the festival of Pesach. Avraham made them matzahs. We know that Avraham made the angels matzahs. In the Torah, it's called ugot, which means a cake, but it means a matzah. And the commentaries actually prove from the wording that Abraham's matzahs were round, which makes sense because they were handmade matzahs that Abraham was making. There was no machine matzah in those days, and he would make handmade round matzahs. Now, why was Abraham making a round matzah? Because Abraham had a point to prove. Everybody else was making matzah with corners, bread with corners to it, representing their deities and their gods. Abraham had one God. So he made a matzah that was round with no corners at all. So that's just a side point. That's a separate detail to the original debate that I shared with you about square versus round. Just some historical context is that Abraham's bread was round with no corners to it, representing one Hashem. Do you now understand why we have round challahs over the high holiday period? It's a beautiful insight. Why do we have round challahs over Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? Where that custom come from to have round challahs over Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? What happened to our normal kitkas? We now have round. So one answer, or I think a typical answer, is that the round challah represents a crown, because it looks like a crown. And it's the crown of Hashem, because we're crowning God as king on Rosh Hashanah. That's one explanation. But another explanation based on what I just shared with you, it makes sense that Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is about recognizing one God. And how do you recognize one God? By the round shape with no corners to it, because the corners would represent the different deities. And on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, we want to have a round challah representing the oneness of God. I thought that was a fascinating insight. It doesn't mean you can't have square matzahs today. It's just an interesting discussion you could create around the Seder table on the shape of the matzah. Speaking about shapes and speaking about round, we know that round represents the cycle of life. After a family comes back from the funeral of a loved one, we have a meal. And that meal is round items of food, either an egg or a bagel, which is a meal that they have after the funeral. What's the purpose of that meal? It's a meal as a reminder that life is like a cycle. It's like a circle that goes around. So right now we're mourning, we're sitting shiva, and please God, there'll be times of celebration, times of comfort and simcha for our families in the future. So we have that as well on the Seder night. We actually have 2 points in the Seder night when we have an egg. Right? One is the beitzah on the Seder table. So the beitzah is the egg on the Seder table. What does the beitzah represent? The beitzah represents the Haggadah offering. The Haggadah offering is the Yom Tov offering that was offered up in the temple on Yom Tov. Obviously, we don't have a temple today, so instead of an offering, we have a Haggadah. Instead of a Haggadah offering, we have an egg, which is a cooked item that represents the Haggadah offering. The zroa, the shank bone, represents the Paschal lamb, and the egg represents the Haggadah offering. That's one time we have the egg on the Seder table. There's another time that we have the egg on the Seder table, and that is just before Shulchan Aruch. There's a minhag, there's a custom. It's not one of the items. It's not one of the items of the Seder night. It's not one of the 15 steps. But there is a minhag to have egg before we start our meal. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And minhag Yisrael, the customs of Israel, are very important. Very important. So we have a custom to have the egg, to eat the egg. So why do we eat the egg? So many people think that we eat the egg because that's the Haggadah offering. right? It's there for the Haggadah offering, so you may as well eat it. There's more to it. There's more to it. Do you know that the first day of Pesach always falls out on the same day as Tisha B'Av? Always in the Jewish calendar. The day of Tisha B'Av falls out on the same day as Pesach. So we actually pause on Pesach. We stop on Pesach and we reflect on Tisha B'Av. Especially now during exile, when we don't have the temple and we can't offer up the Paschal lamb. Even more so now we focus on Tisha B'Av. And we realize that we can't have the Korban Pesach. That's why we eat the egg before Shulchan Aruch. Because to remind us of Tisha B'Av. It's interesting, on Tisha B'Av we also have an egg with ashes. Right? The meal of Tisha B'Av is egg, bread, and ashes. Why an egg? Because we remind ourselves on Tisha B'Av that life is like a cycle. And now we're mourning the destruction of the temple, and please God will be able to celebrate good things in the future. So on Pesach night, we do the same thing. On Pesach, we pause for a moment. We recognize that we don't have the temple. We don't have the Beit HaMikdash. It's the same day as Tisha B'Av, right? And we eat the egg before we sit and eat Shulchan Aruch. We eat the egg to remind us that the state of galus, the state of exile, is only temporary. And please God, we'll get to a point when we can celebrate properly in bringing the Paschal lamb to Yerushalayim. It's quite a fascinating point. Also, there's something else to keep in mind. How many years was Abraham told that his children will be in exile for? So Abraham was told at the Brit Ben Abtarim, at the covenant that Hashem made with Abraham. It's called the covenant of the parts. Abraham was taught that his children will be in exile for 400 years. It was actually 430 from when the covenant was told to Abraham. 430. It was 400 years from when Yitzchak was born, all the way until we came out of Egypt. 400 years. Now, Abraham was told that the Jewish people will be slaves for 400 years. We actually were not slaves for 400 years. We weren't even slaves we were in Egypt for 210 years. We weren't slaves for all 210 years. We were slaves from when Miriam was born. We're about 90 odd years we were slaves for. A bit older than Moshe. Moshe was 80 when we came out of Egypt, a bit older than Moshe Rabbeinu, because Miriam was there already at the time of slavery. So why am I mentioning this? Because at the end, we actually didn't have the 400 years that Abraham was told. We had 210 years of being in a foreign land, and then we add on years of Yitzchak's travels and Abraham's travels, and they all accumulate towards 400. So the rabbis teach us that because we actually did not sit the 400 years in exile, we didn't have the 400 years in Mitzrayim, the Jewish people were destined to future exiles in the future. Why? Because the exiles in the future would accumulate in order to cover up those years that we were missing of the 400 years in Mitzrayim. And that's the reason why we have the egg. Because although we're celebrating Pesach and the Exodus, we're also remembering that there's going to be future exiles, or there have been exiles besides the Exodus out of Egypt. Besides Egypt, there's been other exiles, and that's been painful. And there's been loss to the Jewish community. And that's why we have the egg on the Seder night, to remind us of those exiles too. This point I just mentioned, this balance, the cycle of the egg, and the ups and the downs of the Jewish people, and the simchas and the mourning periods that we experience, is something that's a fundamental theme throughout the Seder night. And I want to try and highlight this in your Seder. What do I mean? So if you look at the Manishtana, and I have highlighted this in previous years, but I think it's an important point to highlight again, especially for those who haven't heard it before. But even if you have heard it before, it's worthwhile hearing it again. In the Manishtana, it's 4 random questions, but they're actually not random questions. They're actually spot on. The child's asking a question here. What are we doing here tonight? Are we thinking back and reminiscing about exile and slavery and hard work that our forefathers went through? Is that what we're focusing on? Or are we focusing on redemption, freedom, the new world? And look at the items of the Manishtana. The child sees, number one, that we're eating matzah and not chametz. Matzah reminds us of the bread of affliction. It is the bread of affliction. The child sees that we're eating maror instead of other vegetables. So those 2 items seem to indicate that we're thinking back to Egypt. That's what we're doing here tonight. We're reminiscing about Egypt. But then he says, hold on, look at the other 2 items. You're dipping, and dipping twice, and that's a sign of freedom. And you're leaning, and leaning is also a sign of freedom. So the child turns to his father or his mother and asks the question, what are we doing here tonight? Are we talking about slavery, or are we talking about freedom? Some of the stages of the Seder night focus on slavery. Some of the stages of the Seder night focus on freedom. And the answer is both. We talk about halach ma'anya, the bread of affliction. We start talking about matzah that our forefathers ate in Egypt. Much of the beginning of Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves in the land of Egypt. Much of the beginning of the Haggadah talks about slavery. We reminisce about how difficult it was in the concentration camps, working and slaving around for Paroi and other leaders throughout history. That's the beginning of the Seder night. And then as we get closer and closer to the end, we start talking about Hallel and redemption and freedom. Hallelujah, praising God. Suddenly we change context. Now we're talking about the simcha and the joy. So I mentioned that in the context of the round egg that we eat before Shulchan Aruch, because we're reminding ourselves at that point that there are high points and low points, the Jewish people. And sometimes we're on a high and sometimes we're on a low. And we just have to be mindful of that and to realize that life is a journey, like the round matzah or like the round egg too. And this point is highlighted again in the story of the 5 sages, just after Manishtana and after Avadim Hayinu. So if you have your Haggadah in front of you, you can actually find it, because I want to highlight something here which is so relevant. If you find the Manishtana, which you should be able to find the Manishtana in your Haggadah, at the beginning of Magid, you'll then see Avadim Hayinu, which is the first paragraph straight after the Manishtana. And after Avadim Hayinu comes Maaseh, a story, the story of the 5 sages in Bnei Brak. I'm not sure if Bnei Brak has the greatest reputation in today's times of COVID. Unfortunately, Bnei Brak didn't behave themselves as they should have. But nonetheless, Bnei Brak in those times was a holy city. There are also very good elements in Bnei Brak until today. But 5 sages were sitting in Bnei Brak. But this also has a very powerful lesson to it. Do you know when they were sitting? They were sitting in Bnei Brak a year after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. Why were they sitting in Bnei Brak? Because the temple was destroyed in Yerushalayim 8 months earlier by the Romans. They no longer had a Beit HaMikdash to go to in Yerushalayim for the Paschal Lamb. So instead, they were stuck in Bnei Brak. And what did they do in Bnei Brak? They sat and they celebrated Pesach. Can you imagine? We've just had the destruction of the second temple, and they're sitting and they're celebrating Pesach, Leil HaSeder. It's quite remarkable. That's the story of the egg. There's destruction, but there's positive thinking that we're going to get out of this, and we're going to experience the redemption. And in fact, what happens? They speak about the exodus out of Egypt the entire night. And what are they telling each other? Just like our forefathers left Egypt, and after so many years of slavery, they managed to go free, so too we also are going to have that. Even though now it's the time of destruction, now it's a time of a churban, but we're going to have a free time. We're going to come out free out of this. And what happens? At the end of the night, the students come running in, and they say, Rabboteinu, Rabboteinu, our rabbis, the time for Shachrit has arrived. What do they mean by that? They meant to say, there's light outside. It's no longer nighttime anymore. It's no longer dark time anymore. It's light outside. Shachrit has arrived. Meaning, we're going to get out of this exile. We're going to get out of the destruction. We're not going to sit in Bnei Brak forever. We're not going to sit in Johannesburg or Melbourne or Toronto forever. We're going to get back to Yerushalayim, to Eretz Yisrael, and be able to offer up the Paschal Lamb again. And that's the cycle, the circle that I was speaking about earlier, is so much highlighted in this story, and how relevant that is for us today. And I would have this conversation too around my Seder table. We're living at the moment, the world is living through a very, very challenging time. I would say this is now exile, plus. Not just living in foreign territory or foreign lands, but now with a virus and an illness that won't allow us to travel, a virus and an illness that has taken away many people's lives and injured many people and hurt many people, and financially, it's chaos. So what should be our response? Our response should be, look at those 5 sages in Bnei Brak. They just lost their temple in Yerushalayim to the Romans. And yet they're able to celebrate Pesach with the positive outlook that it's going to be light again. And that needs to be our approach too. We're dealing with such heavy times and such challenging times. Our approach needs to be, we're going to get out of this. We're going to get out of this. Whether it's financial strain or health or whatever the case may be, or communities and shuls or businesses, we're going to get out of this, because that's been the faith of our sages ever throughout history. And you know what's going to happen? Our students are going to walk into our rooms, into the Seder night, and they're going to say, Rabboteinu, father, mother, Zayda, Baba, it's morning time, it's light time, there's positive time around the corner. We're going to get out of this. And that needs to be our faith and acceptance for this year too, as we celebrate Pesach. We are also in the year after destruction. We're now a year into COVID. So we can really relate to what these 5 sages were going through themselves. I'm going to move down into Haggadah. I'll allow you to try and find where I am, just some insights into some of the wording. If you go to, let's see where we are here. Okay, if you can find Vihisha Amda. You can find Vihisha Amda. It's further down, a couple of pages from where we left off. Try and find Vihisha Amda. Famous song that we all know today. Okay, I'll just give you a few moments to try and find that. And then I want to look at the paragraph just after Vihisha Amda. So just give me a moment here. Give me a moment. So if you look at Vihisha Amda, one paragraph after Vihisha Amda, and there should be a heading of some sort that says Vayered Mitzrayma, and he went down to Egypt. Vayered Mitzrayma, and he went down to Egypt. That's referring to Yaakov Avinu, okay, Jacob, our forefather. The word Mitzrayma, I want to do some numerical value here, gematria. The word Mitzrayma is a numerical value of 385. Okay, just to do the maths, for those who want to follow the maths, or else you can trust me. Mem is 40, Tzadik is 90, Reish is 200. So it's 130 plus 200 is 330. Yud is 10, that's 340. Mem is 40, that's 380. And Hey is 5. 385 is Mitzrayim. It's the same numerical value as the word Shechina. Shechina is also 385. Shechina meaning God's presence. So what's the Haggadah saying? Vayered Mitzrayim, Yaakov went down to Mitzrayim, 385. But the Shechina went with him. God's presence went with Yaakov Avinu, the same 385. And that's also a powerful thought for us as well. We never go into challenging times without God by our side. Okay? So whether it's COVID or whatever else it may be, God is by our side. Sometimes it's easier to see him. Sometimes it's harder to see him. But he's always there standing by our side. The Yaakov went down to Mitzrayim, and the Shechina went together with him as well. If you go, the next paragraph is Vayagar Sham, and he lived there. And the Haggadah speaks about that. And the next paragraph is B'misei Ma'at. B'misei Ma'at means in few number. Yaakov Avinu and his family were very few. How many were they? So the Haggadah says they were Shivim Nefesh. There were 70 souls that went down to Mitzrayim. And how many are we today? Haggadah says, I've now made you numerous as the stars of the skies. But we were initially 70 souls. The word Nefesh. What's the gematria of Nefesh? So the Shin is 300, the Pei is 80, and the Nun is 50. So 300 plus 80 plus 50 equals 430. I mentioned the number 430 earlier. What's 430? That's the amount of years from Abraham Avinu's covenant to Yaakov Avinu, to the Jewish people leaving Egypt. Was 430 years. From the time that Abraham was told about the covenant to the time that they left Egypt was 430 years. So you see that hint, you see the hint in the phrase, the Shivim Nefesh, with 70 souls. Nefesh meaning souls. With 70 souls, we went down to Egypt. The word Nefesh hints the 430 years from Abraham Avinu's covenant, when he was told about exile, to when they actually left Mitzrayim. That's an interesting insight here. The next phrase of the Haggadah says, Vayhi Sham Legoy, and there we became a nation. Okay, there we became a nation. Meaning, in Egypt, we became a nation. It's the strangest concept. We were living among other people, and yet we became a nation. Normally, to become a nation, you need to have freedom. Independence makes you into a nation. We're living under Egyptian rule, and we're becoming a nation. And the Haggadah says, Melamed, this teaches us, Shahayu Yisrael Mitzuyonim Sham, that the Jewish people were recognizably distinct. Mitzuyonim means distinct, that they stuck out, they were different in the land of Egypt. Which is another discussion you can have at the Seder table. When you live among foreign nations, right? What should be the level? There's two values we lead by. Value number one is to know that we are unique, or we are distinct, as the Haggadah says. We are a nation of our own. We could be living in South Africa, we could be living in Australia, we could be living in Israel too. And we have to remember that we're a nation of our own. That's one value, knowing our values, knowing our morals, knowing our Torah. At the same time, we've never separated ourselves from society entirely. So when we lived in Egypt, we lived in Egypt. We became part of Egyptian society. When we lived in Europe, we became part of the European society. When we live in South Africa, we become part of the South African society. So on the one hand, and this is a very, very tough balance, it's a paradox, it's a tough balance. On the one hand, the Haggadah tells us that we became a nation and we remain distinct from the Egyptians. So we know who we are. We eat different, we dress different, we talk different, we behave differently. We have different holidays and vacations to the non-Jewish world. So on the one hand, we're distinct. On the other hand, we acclimatize. We adapt to the society around us. And that could be another discussion that you could have around the Seder table. When do you stand your ground and retain your identity? That's the Haggadah saying, to remain distinct. And when do you have to fit in to what the world requests of you or expects of you? And I must say, this is a dilemma that every Jew or Jewess goes through. Whether you're a student on campus, or whether you're working in the workforce, or whether you're playing golf, or whatever the case may be, you're always going to have this tough balance. When do we subscribe to the Egyptian lifestyle? And when do we hold on to our goy, to our nationhood, which we developed in the land of Egypt? That is a big debate, and I think worthwhile having that conversation around the Seder table. Going on to the next paragraph, where we are, it says, Godol Otzum. We became a great and a mighty nation. And one of the ways we became great and mighty is by multiplying. We were fruitful, as the verse says. And the children of Israel were fruitful and swarmed and increased and became very, very strong, and the land became filled with them. Right? So as we know, a woman would have 6 children in one pregnancy, in one birth. So we multiplied and we increased to so many. And after we multiplied and increased, we were then deserving of Exodus. And I want to focus on 2 interesting points. The first point is, it's brought down, in fact, the Rebbe highlights this point, and he says like this: just like before we left Egypt, the women gave birth to many, many children, and then we were deserving of the Exodus, so too it's going to be in the final redemption too, when Mashiach comes. The Zohar says that Mashiach is waiting for all neshamas to be born into the world. When all souls, when all neshamas are born into the world, then we know that Mashiach is ready to come. And therefore, the push is to bring children to the world, right? Because if that's what the Jewish people did before the Exodus, and that then brought on the Exodus, after we kept on bringing children into Egypt, and we became stronger and stronger, what's Mashiach waiting for? Mashiach is waiting for the same thing. He wants the Jewish nation of today's generation to bring children into the world, that families should grow and multiply and increase, and that will be a prelude that will introduce the Messianic era, and Mashiach will come. That's a powerful thought, that having a child is part of the bringing of Mashiach closer. Now, what about those of us that are far past that age and stage of life, or already have children in the world? So here's another beautiful thing. We know from Moshe and Aharon that teaching another Yid Torah is like giving birth to them. Aaron's children are recorded as Moshe Rabbeinu's children because he taught them Torah. It was his brother, Moshe and Aaron. But because he taught Aaron's children Torah, they're recognized as his own children. So my suggestion to all of us, if we're going to fulfill the words of the Zohar, and the words of the Zohar is that children need to be born into the world in order for the Exodus to come about. Just like it was in the times of the Geula, the times of the redemption out of Egypt, that the more they multiplied, the more they increased, that brought on the Exodus. So too is going to be in today's time when Mashiach arrives, please God, soon. The way we hurry the process of Mashiach's arrival, A, is by giving birth to biological children, and B, by giving birth to spiritual children. That means enlightening someone, sharing with someone, educating someone, because the more you share with them, they become your child. And you bring another soul to the world, and another soul to the world. And the more souls to the world, the better chance of us experiencing Hashem's Mashiach's arrival. Let's just pause here on that point for now. I will summarize this as we wrap up in the next few minutes. But one last point I want to focus on. We have Eliyahu Hanavi's cup, Elijah's cup. This will be the. I want to share some ideas here about Eliyahu Hanavi's cup, which I'm obviously moving down the Haggadah a lot. The cup of Eliyahu Hanavi is the fifth cup, which we actually don't drink ourselves. We drink the four cups, but we don't drink the fifth cup. It's poured after benching. So if you go to after benching, by Shvoy Chamascha, pour out your anger upon the nations of the world who don't recognize you. That's right after benching, is where the fifth cup is poured. The cup of Eliyahu Hanavi. So just a few ideas there. We know that the four cups are represented by the four terms of redemption. V'yitzesi, I took you out. V'yitzalti, I saved you. V'ga'alti, I redeemed you. V'lakachti, and I took you as a nation. And then comes V'heveti, and I brought you into the promised land of Israel. And that will be ultimately, although so many Jews do live in Israel today, but we've still got so many more in the diaspora. So that V'heveti, and I'll bring you into Israel, is going to be fulfilled in its entirety with the return of all of Klal Yisrael. That term V'heveti is the fifth cup. Why? Because Eliyahu Hanavi is going to herald in the coming of Mashiach. And therefore, that's the fifth cup. But there's more insight here. The word V'heveti, and I'll bring you into the promised land of Israel, has the numerical value of 424. V'heveti is 424. Do you know what else has the same numerical value as 424? It's Mashiach ben David. Also 424. So you see that the word V'heveti, and I'll bring you into Israel, which corresponds to the fifth cup of wine, is the same numerical value as Mashiach ben David. 424. Just to confuse you a little bit, sorry if I do, the word David is sometimes spelled with a yud in the word David. Generally not, but sometimes David is spelled with a yud. If you add on a yud to the normal spelling of Mashiach ben David, if you add on an extra yud, which is 10, you'll come to 434, not 424. What's unique about 434? So we said 424 is V'heveti. What's unique to 434? It's the same numerical value as delet. What's a delet? A delet is a door. That's the door that we open up, right? We open up the door to welcome in Eliyahu Hanavi, who's going to bring about Mashiach ben David. So Mashiach ben David, with an extra yud, has a numerical value of 434, which is the same numerical value as delet, opening of the door and bringing in Mashiach. It's interesting to note, historically, the connection to Eliyahu Hanavi. Eliyahu Hanavi, in the times of the Tanakh, recognized that Achav, the king of Israel, was not allowing for Brit Milah, for circumcision, to take place in the country of Israel. It's hard to imagine that you got a land of Israel with Jewish kings, but they're not allowing for Brit Milah, the circumcision, to take place. And Eliyahu Hanavi stood up for this, and he decreed from heaven, he decreed a famine over the land of Israel because they weren't circumcising their children. There's a difference of opinion whether God wanted to punish Eliyahu Hanavi for being so harsh on the people, or he wanted to reward Eliyahu Hanavi for being so kind, or for being so disciplined in punishing the people. But either way, whichever way you go, Hashem made a rule. He said, Eliyahu Hanavi, because you stood up for Brit Milah, I'm going to have you present at every Brit Milah in the future. And that's why we have till today, Kisei Shel Eliyahu Hanavi. We have Elijah's seat at a Brit Milah because God told him that you stood up for the Brit Milah, you stood up for circumcision back in the days of Achav. Again, either it's seen as a punishment to Eliyahu for being too harsh, or it's seen as a reward for Eliyahu Hanavi for doing the right thing. But either way, Eliyahu Hanavi comes to every Brit. And that's why he's there. This is another insight. Why is Eliyahu Hanavi there on Seder night? Because he's there to testify about us. He's there to say, I know he has a bris, and he has a bris, and he has a bris. I was present at every one of their brises. Why is it important to know that? Because you're not allowed to have the Paschal lamb if you haven't been circumcised. So having Eliyahu Hanavi present there to testify about all our Brit Milah, all our circumcision, and now it enables us to be able to partake of the Paschal lamb, praise God, we'll be able to do so. So those are some of the insights that I wanted to highlight on the Seder night. Just to summarize them, because we're going to do a quick summary, and then what we'll do is we'll allow for some questions. If there's anyone that would like to ask questions, you'll be more than welcome to. We started speaking about the order, the Seder. We started speaking about the order of the night. It's a ritual, it's a service. It's not just a social gathering or a classroom educational gathering. It's a religious service. It's like the Mizbeach, like the altar, the service of God. We spoke about number 15 steps of the Seder night, which is Yud and Hey, and represents our intellect and understanding of the Seder night. Yak Nahaz was that special order. Remember, if you get woken up in the middle of your sleep or stopped at Moshe's, what is Yak Nahaz? It's that service that we say, the Kiddush service between Shabbos and Yom Tov. We debated round matzah or square matzah. What does round represent? What does square represent? What's the historical context of Abraham having round matzah with the angels who came to visit him? That took us on to the egg, and the egg is also round, and it reminds us of Tisha B'Av, which falls out on the same day of Pesach. It's the time, it's a recognition that we don't have the temple, we don't have the Paschal lamb, and therefore we have the egg out of mourning for that. We spoke about the 5 sages in Bnei Brak sitting and dining and celebrating Pesach, even though it's the year after destruction, because Am Yisrael are always believers that there'll be light at the end of the tunnel. And then we gave a few gematrias. Mitzrayim, going down to Egypt, is the same as Shechina. God's presence comes with us. Nefesh is 430, reminding us of Abraham's covenants until when they all left Egypt. We spoke about the debate of when you remain a distinct nation and when you become and when you adapt to the nation you're living among. It's a tough balance as to where to draw the line. We spoke about the importance of bringing children to the world, because when we bring children to the world, it brings about the Exodus. And either that means biological children or it means spiritual children, and educating people and teaching people like Moshe taught Aaron's sons. And then finally, Eliyahu Hanavi's cup, and the fact that it's associated closely to the Heveti, to bring you into the land of Israel, which is Mashiach ben David, the arrival of Mashiach, which Eliyahu Hanavi will be part of as well. So let me just pause here for a moment, and I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you all those who are listening later on to this recording.